My name is Christina, and I'm 30 years old. When I was 12, my world shattered upon discovering I was the product of my mother's affair. What followed was years of escalating abuse from my half-siblings and stepfather. They bullied, starved, and assaulted me, even locking me in a basement for days. At 15, I escaped exposed their cruelty and watched them face justice. Now 15 years later, they've reappeared, claiming they've changed and seeking reconciliation. But can people truly change after such monstrous behavior? Before I share my story, let me know where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe if you want more stories of survival and healing. My early childhood memories paint a picture of what I thought was a normal, happy family. We lived in a middle-class suburban neighborhood in Chicago in a blue 2-story house with a neat front yard where my mother Sarah planted tulips every spring. My stepfather Richard worked as an accountant at a large firm downtown, while my mother was a part-time receptionist at a local dental office. I had 3 half-siblings, though I didn't know they were only half related to me until much later. James was the oldest at 17, tall with dark hair like Richard. Allison was 16 with a natural talent for sports, and Richard's serious demeanor. Thomas was 14, quiet, but with a sharp mind for mathematics. And then there was me, 12 years old, with wavy auburn hair that didn't quite match anyone else in the family. My relationship with my mother was special. She would brush my hair every night before bed, telling me stories about her childhood in Michigan. We shared a love for art and creativity. On weekends, we would visit the Art Institute of Chicago, where she would patiently explain different painting techniques and art movements to me. Looking back, I can now see the subtle signs that something was different about me. Comments from neighbors about how I didn't quite look like my siblings. The family photos where everyone had dark hair and eyes except me, with my auburn hair and hazel eyes. The way Richard would sometimes look at me, with a flicker of something I couldn't identify when I was younger, but now recognize as resentment. Despite these undercurrents, I was a happy child. I excelled in school, particularly in art and literature. My 4th grade teacher, Ms. Wilson, even entered one of my watercolor paintings in a regional art competition where I won 2nd place. My mother framed the certificate and hung it proudly in our living room, though I noticed Richard never commented on it. My siblings were older and had their own interests and friends, so we weren't particularly close. But our interactions were normal enough. James would occasionally help me with my homework. Allison would let me tag along when her friends came over, treating me like an annoying but tolerated little sister. Thomas and I rarely interacted beyond passing each other in the hallway or sitting across from each other at dinner. My 12th birthday was the last truly happy memory I have of my family together. My mother organized a small party in our backyard with a few friends from school. She baked my favorite chocolate cake with buttercream frosting and decorated it with little paintbrushes made of fondant. Richard even seemed in a good mood, grilling hamburgers and laughing with some of the parents. James and Allison helped with the games, and Thomas actually gave me a sketch pad as a present. That evening, after everyone had gone home, my mother hugged me tightly and whispered that she was so proud of the person I was becoming. I felt completely loved and secure, blissfully unaware that my world was about to implode. In the weeks following my birthday, I began noticing increased tension between my parents. They would stop talking when I entered a room. Richard would come home late, smelling of whiskey. My mother's eyes often looked red and puffy in the mornings. I caught her staring at me sometimes with a look of such profound sadness that it frightened me. One night, I woke up to raised voices. I crept down the hallway and sat at the top of the stairs where I could hear my parents arguing in the kitchen. Richard's voice was low and threatening, my mother's pleading and tearful. I couldn't make out everything they were saying, but I heard Richard hiss, "That letter changes everything, Sarah. Everything." I didn't understand then what was happening, but something fundamental had shifted in our family dynamic. I went back to bed with a knot in my stomach, unaware that the foundations of my life were crumbling beneath me. The tension continued to build. Richard began working later hours, and my mother became distracted and anxious. My siblings started treating me differently too. Small things at first, like Allison refusing to save me a seat on the school bus, or James making comments about how I didn't look like a real Peterson. One afternoon, I came home from school to find my mother sitting alone in the kitchen staring at an old shoebox of photos. When she saw me, she quickly wiped her eyes and forced a smile, but I could tell something was deeply wrong. She hugged me tighter than usual that night before bed, as if she was afraid I might disappear. 2 days later, I came home from school to hear another argument more heated than any before. I stood frozen in the hallway as Richard's voice boomed through the house. "She deserves to know what kind of mother she has, that she's nothing but your mistake, your shameful secret." I felt the floor drop from beneath me. What was he talking about? What mistake? What secret? I pressed myself against the wall, heart hammering in my chest as the argument continued, unaware that everything I thought I knew about my family and myself was about to be shattered forever. It was a crisp October afternoon when my life changed forever. I had just returned from school, looking forward to showing my mother the A I received on my English essay. The house was unnervingly quiet when I entered, but I could hear muffled voices coming from my parents' bedroom. I quietly walked up the stairs, not wanting to interrupt what sounded like an intense conversation. As I approached their room, Richard's voice suddenly rose to a thunderous level. "How could you keep this letter from me all these years, Sarah? From her biological father, the man you cheated on me with." My heart stopped. Biological father cheated. I stood frozen outside their door, my backpack slipping from my shoulder and thudding softly against the carpet. I was going to tell her when she was older. My mother sobbed. Michael is dead now. There was no point in disrupting her life. No point. Richard's voice was razor sharp. She's living proof of your betrayal. Every time I look at her, I see your lie. I must have made a sound because suddenly the bedroom door swung open and there stood Richard, his face contorted with anger. Behind him, my mother looked horrified, her mascara streaking down her pale cheeks. "Christina," she whispered. "Oh God, Christina." That evening, through tears and broken sentences, my mother confessed everything. 12 years ago, while Richard was away on a 3-month business assignment, she had a brief affair with her co-worker Michael. When she discovered she was pregnant, Michael had already relocated to Seattle. She told Richard the baby was his, and he had no reason to doubt her until recently, when he found an old letter from Michael hidden in her jewelry box. Michael died in a car accident 4 years ago. My mother explained, her hands trembling. "He never knew about you." Richard stood in the corner of the living room, arms crossed, face like stone. "I've raised another man's child for 12 years, he said coldly. "Paid for everything, treated her like my own, and all this time she's been someone else's mistake." "Richard, please," my mother begged. He turned to her, his eyes flashing. "You need to deal with your mistake, Sarah, or I'm leaving and taking my real children with me." That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, feeling like my identity had been erased. Who was I, if not Christina Peterson, whose blood ran through my veins? I studied my hands and face in the mirror, searching for traces of a stranger named Michael. Was my love for art from him, my auburn hair, the slight upturn of my nose that didn't match anyone in the Peterson family? The days that followed were surreal. My mother tried to comfort me, assuring me that she loved me just as much, that nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Richard could barely look at me during meals, and my siblings, they had overheard everything. James was the first to react. The very next morning at breakfast, when I reached for the orange juice, he pulled it away. "This is for real, Petersons," he said with a sneer. My mother gasped, but Richard continued reading his newspaper as if nothing had happened. School became an entirely different kind of nightmare. Alison, who attended the same middle school, started avoiding me in the hallways. When her friends asked why, I overheard her say, "Found out she's not really my sister, just some random guy's kid my mum got stuck with." The rumour spread like wildfire. By lunchtime, kids were staring and whispering. Someone scrawled "bastard" on my locker. I spent the afternoon crying in the girls' bathroom until a sympathetic janitor found me and called my mother to pick me up. Home offered no sanctuary. Thomas, who had previously been indifferent to my existence, now followed his older sibling's lead. When I tried to join him watching TV in the living room, he simply got up and left. My mother was caught in an impossible situation. She tried to stand up for me, but Richard's ultimatum hung over her head. She began to crumble under the pressure, becoming thin and anxious, jumping at small noises, crying when she thought no one could hear. One night, about 3 weeks after the revelation, I heard her pleading with Richard. "They're treating her terribly. You have to say something to them." "They're processing the fact that their mother is a liar," he replied coldly. "Let them deal with it their own way." Gruesome. The truth felt like a contagious disease that had infected our entire household. Family dinners, once filled with conversations about our days, became silent, tense affairs. Richard worked later and later. My mother started taking anxiety medication that left her foggy and distant, and I was left adrift, my foundations crumbling beneath me. The family photos that lined our hallway now seemed like cruel jokes. The childhood memories I cherished were suddenly suspect. Had Richard always known? Had he always resented me? Was every birthday gift, every bedtime story, every good job on a report card Just an act, the world I had known for 12 years vanished overnight, replaced by something cold and hostile. I no longer belonged anywhere, not in my family, not at school, not even in my own skin. I was a walking reminder of my mother's betrayal, and everyone seemed determined to make sure I never forgot it. The worst part was watching my mother deteriorate, knowing I was the cause of her pain. One afternoon, I found her staring at old baby photos of me, sobbing quietly. "I'm so sorry, she whispered when she saw me. "I never meant for this to happen. I thought I was protecting you." I hugged her tightly, feeling our roles reverse as I became the comforter. "It's not your fault, Mom." But even as I said it, a small dark part of me wondered if it was. If I was a mistake that should never have happened. If everyone's lives would have been better if I had never been born. That thought, once planted, began to grow like a poisonous weed in my mind. Maybe they were right to hate me. Maybe I deserved what was happening. Maybe this was all my fault. I couldn't have imagined then how much worse things would get, or how the revelation of my parentage would become just the first step in a descent into true cruelty. The real abuse had not even begun. In the weeks following the devastating revelation, the atmosphere in our house transformed from merely tense to actively hostile. What started as snide comments and cold shoulders from my siblings evolved into a coordinated campaign of cruelty. James, at 17, appointed himself as the ringleader. He began calling me names that cut deeper than any physical blow. "Hey, affair brat," he would say when passing me in the hallway. Or, "How's the mistake doing today?" Always just quietly enough that my mother couldn't hear, but loud enough to make sure I absorbed every syllable. Alison took her campaign to school. She was popular, a volleyball star with a wide social circle. Within days, she had turned most of our shared acquaintances against me. My mum cheated and got stuck with her. She told them as if I was some defective product rather than a person. "She's not really family, just some random guy's kid we're forced to live with." The isolation was immediate and crushing. Friends who had come to my birthday party just weeks before now avoided eye contact in the hallways. Lunch invitations stopped. Text messages went unanswered. By Thanksgiving, I was eating alone in a bathroom stall to avoid the stares and whispers in the cafeteria. Thomas, at 14, followed his oldest sibling's lead. He began systematically stealing my belongings. Small things at first, like hair ties or coloured pencils. When I confronted him, he would shrug innocently and say, "Prove it. No one will believe you anyway." He was right. When I tried to tell my mother about the theft of a special bracelet she had given me, Richard interrupted. "She's probably just misplaced it and wants attention. She's been acting out since she found out about Michael." My mother, increasingly medicated and withdrawn, merely looked at her plate and said nothing. The bracelet later reappeared broken into pieces in my school backpack. The first time food became a weapon was at Thanksgiving dinner. Richard's parents were visiting, unaware of the family secret. As we sat around the table, James deliberately took the slice of pumpkin pie that had been placed at my setting. "James," my mother said weakly, "that was Christina's piece. I think real family members should get served first." He replied, staring directly at me as he took a large bite. Richard's mother looked confused. "What does he mean, real family?" The awkward silence that followed was broken only by Richard clearing his throat and changing the subject. I excused myself and spent the rest of the evening in my room, hungry and humiliated. After that, food shortages became common. My siblings would take my portion at dinner, claiming there wasn't enough. If I made myself a sandwich, it would disappear from the refrigerator. My mother tried to intervene, but her effectiveness waned as her mental health deteriorated. I began hiding granola bars and apples in my room, rationing them carefully to supplement the increasingly meager meals I was allowed. By Christmas, I had lost 10 pounds from my already slender frame. The physical intimidation started gradually. A shoulder check in the hallway, a foot extended to trip me as I walked past. James accidentally closing my fingers in a door. Each incident minor enough to be explained away, but the pattern was unmistakable. When I tried to tell my art teacher, Ms. Bennett, that things were difficult at home, she assumed I was referring to typical sibling rivalry, compounded by teenage hormones. "Brothers and sisters fight," she said kindly, "especially during adolescence. I'm sure things will get better." But they didn't get better. They got worse. One Friday afternoon in January, I was walking down the stairs carrying a load of laundry when I felt a hard shove from behind. I tumbled down the remaining steps, laundry flying everywhere, and landed hard on my right arm. The pain was immediate and blinding. When I looked up, James was standing at the top of the stairs, his expression cold. "Oops," he said. "You should be more careful. You're so clumsy lately." My mother took me to the emergency room where I was diagnosed with a sprained wrist. When she gently asked what had happened, I was too terrified to tell the truth. James had made it clear there would be consequences for tattling. I tripped, I said, avoiding her eyes. Just like James said, the incident with the stairs marked a turning point. My siblings now knew they could hurt me physically and face no consequences. The abuse escalated accordingly. My few remaining friends at school gradually stopped coming over to our house. The last one, a girl named Zoe, who had been my best friend since 3rd grade, came over to work on a science project in February. When she arrived, Alison answered the door and loudly announced, "The charity case is here to see the bastard." Zoe's shocked expression told me everything I needed to know. She was polite throughout our project work, but she never came back. At school, she began sitting with a different group at lunch. My isolation was now complete. At school, I was the subject of rumours and pity. At home, I was a walking target for my siblings' cruelty. My mother was present in body, but increasingly absent in mind, consumed by her own guilt and Richard's growing coldness toward her. The final straw came when I discovered all my art supplies destroyed. I had been working on a portfolio for a summer art program, spending hours on detailed drawings and paintings. One afternoon, I returned from school to find my artwork shredded, my paints emptied onto the carpet, my brushes snapped in half. On top of the destruction sat a note in James's handwriting, "Mistakes don't deserve nice things." I broke down completely, sobbing over the ruined remains of the one thing that had been keeping me going. My mother found me there and finally seemed to snap out of her fog long enough to confront Richard. "This has gone too far," I heard her say. They destroyed her art supplies. "This isn't normal teenage behaviour, it's cruelty." Richard's response was chilling. "They're adjusting to finding out their mother lied to them for years. Christina will have to toughen up. The real world isn't kind to people like her." That night, I cried myself to sleep wondering what people like her meant. People born from affairs, people who weren't wanted, people who had the misfortune of being born at all. I didn't know then that the worst was yet to come, that the destruction of my art supplies was just a prelude to far more sinister acts. But I was beginning to understand that my home had become a battlefield, and I was outnumbered, outmatched, and running out of places to hide. The spring of my 13th year marked the beginning of the most horrific period of my life. My mother's mental health had deteriorated to the point where she was barely functioning. After a particularly severe anxiety attack, she was hospitalized for what Richard called a rest. With her gone, there was no one left to even pretend to protect me. The day after she left, Richard called a family meeting. James, Alison, Thomas, and I sat in the living room as he paced back and forth, his face like thunder. "Your mother is very sick," he said, his eyes fixing on me. "The stress of her situation has finally broken her. While she's recovering, we all need to adjust to a new normal around here." The new normal quickly became apparent. Richard delegated all household chores to me alone, while my siblings were free to focus on their extracurricular activities and social lives. I was expected to cook, clean, do laundry, and maintain the yard, all while keeping up with my schoolwork. Any failure to complete these tasks resulted in privileges being revoked. Food, hot water, even electricity to my room. "Consider it rent," Richard said coldly when I protested. "You're not my responsibility, but I'm still putting a roof over your head." With my mother gone, my siblings' abuse became more brazen and coordinated. They no longer feared consequences because there were none. Richard either didn't see their behaviour or tacitly approved of it. The food situation worsened dramatically. James would wait until I served dinner, then deliberately spill my portion onto the floor. "Oops," he would say with mock concern. "Guess you'll have to make do without." Alison began stealing my clothing, leaving me with inadequate protection against the harsh Chicago winter. When I confronted her, she simply said, "Prove it. Besides a fair, brats don't deserve new things." Thomas, though younger, proved to be the most creative in his torments. He would hide dead insects in my bed, pour water on my homework, and once replaced my shampoo with hair removal cream. Patches of my hair fell out before I realized what was happening. The physical abuse escalated as well. What had started as accidental shoving became deliberate attacks. James, now 18 and much larger than my 13-year-old frame, would pin me against walls, his forearm crushing my windpipe, just enough to make breathing difficult, but not enough to leave obvious marks. "No one would care if you just disappeared," he whispered during one such attack. "You're nothing, not even really human." Alison preferred psychological torture, spreading increasingly vicious rumours at school. According to her, I was not just illegitimate, but also mentally unstable. A thief, a liar. She convinced her friends to leave threatening notes in my locker. One particularly cruel message read, Your real dad died to get away from you. Your mum went crazy because of you. Do everyone a favor and follow his lead. I was losing weight rapidly, my clothes hanging on my diminishing frame. Dark circles formed permanent shadows under my eyes. My grades, once exemplary, plummeted as I struggled to complete homework, while fulfilling my endless chores and navigating the minefield of abuse at home. One teacher, Ms. Winters, noticed the change. Christina, is everything all right at home? She asked after class one day. You seem different lately. I nearly told her everything then. The words were on the tip of my tongue, but just as I opened my mouth, I saw Allison in the hallway watching. The threat in her eyes was unmistakable. Everything's fine. I lied. Just tired from studying. But it was the basement that became the center of my nightmares. Our house had an unfinished basement, cold, damp, and dimly lit. It housed the laundry facility's holiday decorations and various discarded items from years past. The first basement incident occurred when I was accused of taking too long in the bathroom one morning. James and Thomas grabbed me still in my pajamas and dragged me down the basement stairs. Despite my screams and struggles, they locked the door from the outside, leaving me trapped in the chilly darkness. Consider it a timeout, James called through the door. Maybe you'll learn to be more considerate. I spent the entire weekend locked in that basement missing school on Friday. There was a small utility sink where I could get water, but no food, no proper bathroom, no heat. When they finally let me out Sunday night, I was shaking with cold and hunger, my voice hoarse from screaming for help. If you tell anyone about this, James threatened, next time will be much worse, and there will be a next time. He was right. The basement became their favorite punishment for imagined infractions. A glass broken accidentally, 3 hours in the basement. Homework not completed to Richard's satisfaction, a night in the basement. Looking at James disrespectfully, a weekend in the basement. Each time was worse than the last. Sometimes they would turn off the water to the utility sink. Sometimes they would leave a single granola bar placed just out of reach to torment me. Once Thomas caught a rat in a trap and left its corpse next to my makeshift bed of old blankets. Through it all, Richard remained willfully oblivious. When I missed school due to basement imprisonments, he called in with excuses about family emergencies or illness. When neighbours asked about the screaming they sometimes heard, he explained it away as television or typical teenage drama. My mother called occasionally from the hospital, her voice distant and foggy from medication. I wanted desperately to tell her what was happening, but our conversations were always supervised by Richard or one of my siblings. Besides, I feared what might happen to her if she knew. Would the shock cause a complete breakdown? Would Richard follow through on his threat to leave her? I couldn't risk it. The pinnacle of horror came shortly after my 14th birthday. My mother, still hospitalized, had managed to have a small gift, delivered a set of charcoal pencils and a sketchbook with a note expressing her love and hope for my future. James found the package before I could hide it. That evening, he, Allison, and Thomas confronted me in my bedroom. So you're getting special treatment again, James sneered, holding up the gift. Please, I begged. It's all I have from her. James smiled cruelly. You know the rules. Mistakes don't get nice things. What followed was the worst beating I had endured. James held me down while Thomas punched me repeatedly in the stomach to avoid visible bruises. Allison stood by criticizing their technique as if they were rehearsing a play rather than assaulting their sister. When they were done, they dragged my semi-conscious body to the basement. Through swollen eyes, I watched James tear the sketchbook to pieces and snap each charcoal pencil one by one. Enjoy your new art studio, Allison laughed as they locked the door. I spent 5 days in that basement. 5 days of darkness, hunger, and pain. 5 days wondering if I would die there, if anyone would even notice I was gone. 5 days praying for a rescue that seemed increasingly unlikely. On the 5th night, delirious from hunger and pain, I heard my mother's voice in my head, strong and clear. You have to save yourself, Christina. No one else will. In that moment, something within me hardened into resolve. If I was going to survive, I needed to escape not just the basement, but the house, the family, the entire nightmare my life had become. With newfound determination, I began searching the basement for anything that might help me break free. Knowing this might be my only chance for survival, the basement's small window was my only hope for escape. It was positioned high on the wall just below ceiling level and reinforced with security bars. For 5 days, I had stared at that window thinking it impossible to breach. But desperation is a powerful motivator. On that fifth night, as the house above me grew quiet, I dragged an old metal shelving unit beneath the window. The noise seemed thunderous in the silent basement, and I froze repeatedly, terrified that someone would hear. But no footsteps came, no angry voices called down. The family that had imprisoned me had also grown careless, confident in their control. The shelving unit wasn't quite tall enough, so I stacked it with boxes of Richard's old accounting books. The tower wobbled precariously as I climbed my weakened body, protesting every movement. My ribs ached from Thomas's punches, and hunger made my vision blur. But the thought of one more day in captivity was more unbearable than any physical pain. When I reached the window, I examined the security bars more closely. They were old and rusted, where they connected to the concrete, weakened by years of Chicago's harsh weather. I gripped one bar and pushed, feeling a slight give. Hope surged through me like an electric current. I took an abandoned snow shovel from nearby and wedged its metal edge between the bar and the concrete. Using my body weight, I levered against it, ignoring the screaming pain in my ribs. For several agonizing minutes, nothing happened. Then, with a sound that seemed deafening to my terrified ears, the concrete crumbled and one bar came loose. I worked feverishly, prying at the adjacent bars until I had created an opening just wide enough for my emaciated frame to squeeze through. Outside, the cold March air hit my face like a blessing. I was free, but far from safe. Our house was dark except for a single light in Richard's study. I knew I couldn't return for clothes or belongings. Whatever I was wearing, a dirty t-shirt, jeans and socks was all I had now. Not even shoes to protect my feet. I ran through the backyard, climbed the fence and kept running, ignoring the pain of stones and sticks cutting into my socked feet. I had no plan beyond escape, no destination beyond our way. But as I reached the end of our neighborhood, a name came to me. Ms. Bennett, my art teacher. She lived only a few miles away. I had been to her house once for an art club gathering. She had always been kind to me, had noticed my declining health and appearance, even when others ignored it. The journey to her home was a blur of pain, fear, and determination. I stuck to back streets and shadows, terrified that Richard or James might come looking for me. Several times I had to hide from passing cars, convinced that every vehicle was hunting me. By the time I reached Ms. Bennett's modest bungalow, my socks were shredded, my feet bloody, and my body on the verge of collapse. It was nearly midnight when I rang her doorbell, then pounded weakly on the door when there was no immediate answer. When she finally opened it, wrapped in a bathrobe, and squinting with confusion, I could barely speak. "Christina," she gasped, taking in my disheveled appearance. "My God, what happened to you?" I opened my mouth to explain, but found I couldn't form the words. The shock, exhaustion, and relief were too overwhelming. Instead, I simply collapsed into her arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Ms. Bennett called 911 immediately. I remember fragments of what followed: paramedics wrapping me in blankets, police officers asking gentle questions, the bright lights of the hospital emergency room. I was diagnosed with malnutrition, dehydration, 3 cracked ribs, numerous contusions, and frostbite on my feet. When I was stable enough to speak, 2 people came to my hospital room, a police detective named Officer Martinez and a social worker named Ms. Daniels. They sat beside my bed and asked me to tell them everything. And for the first time since the abuse began, I did. I spoke for hours, my voice sometimes breaking, sometimes strengthening as I recounted every detail, the revelation of my parentage, the escalating abuse, the starvation, the beatings, the basement imprisonments. Officer Martinez recorded everything, occasionally pausing to ask clarifying questions. Ms. Daniels held my hand when the memories became too painful to bear. "You're incredibly brave," Officer Martinez told me when I finished. "We're going to make sure this never happens to you again." Based on my testimony and the physical evidence of my condition, the police obtained a warrant to search our home. They found everything exactly as I had described: the basement, with its makeshift bed and broken security bars, my room stripped of personal belongings, the hidden cameras James had installed to monitor my movements, something even I hadn't known about, and journals where Allison had actually documented their punishment sessions, as she called them, apparently proud of their cruelty. Richard, James, Allison, and Thomas were all arrested within 24 hours of my escape. The charges were numerous and severe: child abuse, false imprisonment, assault, negligence, and more. My mother, still in the psychiatric hospital, was initially spared arrest, but faced questioning about her role in the abuse. The media attention was immediate and overwhelming. "Suburban horror teen imprisoned and abused by family," read one headline. "Modern Cinderella girl escapes years of torture," proclaimed another. Our quiet suburban neighborhood became the center of a local media frenzy, with reporters camped outside our house and neighbors expressing shocked disbelief. They seemed like such a normal family, one neighbor told a reporter. A little distant perhaps, but we never imagined anything like this. The court proceedings that followed were a painful but necessary part of my healing journey. I had to face my abusers, to look them in the eyes as I testified about what they had done to me. Richard sat stone-faced throughout, showing no remorse. James smirked occasionally, especially when the basement confinements were discussed. Allison cried theatrical tears that fooled no one. Thomas looked genuinely frightened, perhaps realizing for the first time the seriousness of what he had participated in. My mother attended the proceedings after being released from the hospital. Seeing her in the courtroom was one of the most painful moments of my life. She had aged years in months, her once vibrant face now gaunt and lined with grief. When our eyes met, she mouthed, "I'm sorry," before breaking down in tears. During her testimony, she admitted to knowing about some of the abuse, but being too medicated and afraid to intervene effectively. "I failed my daughter in every way possible," she said through tears. "I'll never forgive myself for that." Her testimony was both damning and heartbreaking. While it helped secure convictions for the others, it also resulted in her being charged with child endangerment and neglect. She received a suspended sentence and mandatory psychological treatment, largely due to her cooperation and obvious remorse. Richard was sentenced to 15 years in prison for his role in the abuse. James, tried as an adult despite being just 18, received 12 years. Allison, 16 at the time of arrest, was sentenced to juvenile detention until age 21. Thomas, being 14 and having shown some remorse, received 5 years in juvenile detention with mandatory therapy. As for me, I entered the foster care system. After a brief stay in a group home, I was placed with the Morales family. Elena and Gabriel Morales had fostered dozens of children over the years, many of them from abusive backgrounds. Their home was chaotic but loving, with clear boundaries and consistent support. "Your past shapes you," Elena told me during my first week with them, "but it doesn't define you. What happened to you was monstrous, but you are not damaged goods, Christina. You are a survivor." Those words became my mantra in the difficult months that followed. With the Morales family's encouragement, I began therapy with Dr. Lisbon, a specialist in childhood trauma. Twice a week, I would sit in her calm, sunlit office and gradually unpack the horrors I had endured. "Recovery isn't linear," she would remind me when I had setbacks. "Some days will be harder than others, but each day puts more distance between you and what happened." Slowly, painstakingly, I began to rebuild my life from the shattered pieces. I returned to school, though a different one, to avoid the notoriety that now followed my story. The Morales family helped me reclaim my passion for art, buying me new supplies and setting up a small studio space in their spare room. My mother and I maintained limited contact through supervised visits. Our relationship was complicated by her role in my abuse, but I couldn't bring myself to cut her off entirely. She was getting help attending intensive therapy and substance abuse treatment for the medications she had become dependent on. "I don't expect your forgiveness," she told me during one visit. "I just want you to know that I love you and I always will, no matter what." I didn't know then if forgiveness was possible, but I recognized her genuine remorse. We would have a long road ahead of us if we were to salvage any kind of relationship. By my 16th birthday, I had begun to feel something like normal again. I had friends at my new school who knew my story but didn't define me by it. I was excelling academically once more. My art had evolved, becoming both an escape and a method of processing my trauma. One afternoon, as I sat in the Morales' backyard sketching the sunset, Elena came to sit beside me. "You know," she said gently, "what you did took incredible courage. Not just escaping, but speaking up, testifying. You may have saved other children from similar situations by bringing this to light." I hadn't thought of it that way before. I had been focused solely on survival, on getting through each day without drowning in the memories. But she was right. My testimony had not only brought my abusers to justice, but had also sparked a local conversation about hidden abuse and family violence. That realization marked a turning point in my recovery. I was not just a victim or even a survivor. I was someone who could make a difference, whose voice had power. For the first time since discovering my true parentage, I felt a sense of purpose and identity that was wholly my own. As I approached my 16th birthday, I made a decision that symbolized my determination to move forward. With Elena and Gabriel's support, I legally changed my last name. No longer a Peterson or tied to my unknown biological father's name, I chose Rivera. my maternal grandmother's maiden name, a connection to family history that held no trauma. Christina Rivera, a new name for a new beginning. The person I was becoming might still carry scars from the past, but she also carried hope for the future, a future I was now determined to reclaim for myself. The 15 years between my escape and my 30th birthday were a journey of healing, growth, and rebuilding. After my time with the Morales family, who remained a supportive presence in my life, even after I aged out of foster care, I focused on education as my path forward. Art remained my passion and solace. In my senior year of high school, a portfolio of my work caught the attention of several college recruiters. I was offered a partial scholarship to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, the very museum my mother had taken me to as a child. The irony of returning to the city where my trauma had occurred wasn't lost on me, but I refused to let fear dictate my future. "You don't have to take it," Gabriel Morales said when I expressed hesitation about returning to Chicago. "There are other schools." "No," I replied after careful consideration. "I need to reclaim that city. I won't let them take it from me too." College was transformative. I discovered art therapy, a field that combined my creative talents with my growing desire to help others who had experienced trauma. My own experiences gave me insight that couldn't be taught in classrooms, though I was careful not to let my past overwhelm my professional development. It was during an art therapy internship at a children's hospital that I met David. He was a pediatric nurse with kind eyes and a gentle manner that put even the most frightened children at ease. Our friendship developed slowly over coffee breaks and shared lunches, neither of us rushing the connection that was forming. When I finally told him about my past, we were sitting by Lake Michigan watching a summer sunset. I had learned by then not to lead with my trauma story, but I knew that any serious relationship would require complete honesty. "That explains a lot," he said when I finished, his voice steady, despite the horror in his eyes. "The way you connect with the kids who've been through the worst, the patience you have, it makes sense now." "Does it change how you see me?" I asked, terrified of his answer. He took my hand, his touch light but secure. "It changes how I see what you've overcome. It makes me admire you even more." David became my partner in healing. He understood my occasional nightmares, my need for personal space, my difficulty with certain holidays that triggered memories. He never pressed for details. I wasn't ready to share or tried to fix what wasn't his to repair. My professional life flourished alongside our relationship. After completing my master's degree in art therapy, I developed a program specifically for children from abusive backgrounds. The Safe Colors program used art as a non-threatening way for children to express and process trauma. It was eventually adopted by several hospitals and community centers across the Midwest. In my mid-20s, I received a certified letter from the Illinois Department of Corrections. James was up for parole after serving 8 years of his 12-year sentence. As a victim, I had the right to make a statement at his hearing. The decision to attend the hearing was agonizing. Dr. Lisbon, still my therapist, after all these years, helped me work through the complex emotions it raised. "There's no right answer here," she said. "Attending might give you closure, or it might re-traumatize you. Not attending might leave you wondering. What does your gut tell you?" My gut told me to face him one last time, to let him see that he had failed to break me. David offered to come with me, but this was something I needed to do alone. James looked smaller than I remembered, diminished by prison life and the passage of time. When our eyes met across the parole hearing room, I saw a flicker of something in his expression. Not remorse exactly, but perhaps shock at seeing the confident woman I had become, instead of the terrified child he had tormented. My statement to the parole board was brief but powerful. I described not only the abuse I had suffered, but also the person I had become, despite it. I didn't oppose his parole directly, but made it clear that I believed true rehabilitation required genuine remorse, something I had yet to see from him. The board denied his parole, citing concerns about his rehabilitation progress and the severity of his original crimes. As I left the hearing, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I had faced my abuser and spoken my truth. His power over me was finally completely gone. Around my 27th birthday, David and I were married in a small ceremony by Lake Michigan. Eleanor and Gabriel Morales were there, as were friends from college and colleagues from the hospitals where we worked. My mother attended as well, our relationship having evolved into a cautious but genuine reconciliation over the years. She was sober now, having finally overcome her dependence on anxiety medications. She lived in Wisconsin, working as a receptionist at a women's shelter, a job she had chosen as her own form of atonement. "You look so happy, Mib," she said at the wedding reception, her eyes bright with tears. I never thought I'd see this day. Neither did I admitted. But here we are. A year after our wedding, I gave birth to our daughter Lily. Holding her for the first time, I was overwhelmed by a fierce protectiveness, unlike anything I had ever experienced. I made a silent promise that she would never know the kind of pain I had endured, that her childhood would be filled with the security and love mine had lacked. David and I were intentional parents, discussing at length how my trauma might affect my parenting and how to ensure healthy boundaries. I was terrified of either being too protective or not protective enough, of somehow replicating the dysfunction of my own childhood. "You're not them," David reminded me whenever I doubted myself. "You're breaking the cycle, not continuing it." Over time, I received occasional updates about my former family. Richard remained in prison, having been denied parole twice, due to his continuing refusal to acknowledge wrongdoing. Alison had served her full juvenile sentence and then disappeared from public records. I imagined her starting over somewhere far away, perhaps with a new name. Thomas, after his release from juvenile detention, had reportedly entered counseling programs and was working as a carpenter in northern Michigan. I had no desire to reconnect with any of them. The past was the past, and I had worked too hard to build my new life to risk reopening those wounds. Or so I thought, until the letter arrived. It came on a Tuesday in April, just after my 30th birthday. The return address was unfamiliar, a P.O. box in Chicago. Inside was a 5-page handwritten letter from James. "Christina," it began. "I don't expect you to read this, and I wouldn't blame you if you threw it away unopened. But after 15 years of reflection, I feel compelled to reach out. We've all changed. I've changed. What we did to you was unforgivable, but we're asking for a chance to apologize in person. Mother is dying. Her last wish is to see you once more. Please consider meeting with us. James." I sat at our kitchen table for nearly an hour, reading and rereading the letter until David came home from his shift at the hospital. When I showed it to him, his expression darkened. "You don't owe them anything, sir," he said firmly. "Not a meeting, not forgiveness, nothing." "I know," I replied, folding the letter carefully. "But I think I need to do this. Not for them, but for me. To finally close this chapter completely." The next day, I called Dr. Lisbon and made an emergency appointment. We spent 2 sessions discussing the letter and what it might mean to meet with my former family. Was it a genuine attempt at reconciliation or some new form of manipulation? Was I strong enough to face them without being pulled back into old trauma patterns? What would real closure look like for me? After careful consideration, I decided to agree to one meeting, but on my terms. It would take place in Dr. Lisbon's office with her present. David would be in the waiting room if I needed him, and I would bring a photograph of Lily, but not Lily herself. My new family was precious and would remain separate from the toxic dynamics of my past. I sent a brief response to the P.O. box, setting the date and conditions. Part of me hoped they would refuse giving me an easy out, but 3 days later I received a 1-line reply: "We'll be there. Thank you." As the meeting date approached, I vacillated between anxiety and a strange calm. I had spent years in therapy preparing for moments like this, developing tools to manage trauma triggers and set healthy boundaries. I was no longer the helpless child they had abused. I was a successful professional, a wife, a mother, a whole person they had failed to destroy. The night before the meeting, I stood in Lily's room, watching her sleep, her small chest rising and falling peacefully. "I'm doing this for you too," I whispered, "so that the past stays in the past and never touches your future." Whatever happened tomorrow, I was ready to face it. Not as a victim, not even just as a survivor, but as a woman who had reclaimed her life and built something beautiful from the ashes of her childhood. The meeting would be the final period at the end of a painful chapter, a chapter that had shaped me but no longer defined me. The waiting room of Dr. Lisbon's office felt unusually small that morning. David sat beside me, his hand steady around mine as we waited for my former family to arrive. We had been there for 20 minutes already, my insistence on arriving early giving me time to center myself in the familiar surroundings. "You can still change your mind," David reminded me gently. "At any point, just say the word." I nodded, grateful for his support but determined to see this through. Dr. Lisbon had helped me prepare extensively for this meeting role, playing possible scenarios and establishing clear boundaries. We had agreed on a signal I could give if I needed to end the session immediately. At exactly 11 o'clock, the receptionist's intercom buzzed. "Dr. Lisbon, the Peterson party is here." My heart hammered against my ribs as I heard those words. The Peterson party. a name I had legally abandoned years ago, but which still held the power to transport me back to that basement, to those endless days of hunger and fear. David squeezed my hand. Remember who you are now, Christina Rivera, artist, therapist, wife, mother. Their presence doesn't diminish any of that. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and nodded to the receptionist. I'm ready. Dr. Lisbon appeared from her inner office. Christina, we'll use the larger conference room. I've already explained the ground rules to them. The meeting will last exactly 1 hour, and I'll end it immediately if anyone becomes aggressive or disrespectful. She led me down the hallway to a room I knew well from group therapy sessions. David waited behind in the reception area as we had agreed. This was my journey to complete alone, though knowing he was nearby gave me strength. As Dr. Lisbon opened the door, I braced myself for the rush of emotions that would come with seeing them again. Nothing could have fully prepared me for the reality. They were older, of course. 15 years changes people, but it was more than age that struck me. They seemed diminished, somehow smaller than the monsters my memory had preserved. James, once tall and intimidating, had developed a slight stoop. His dark hair was receding and stress lines marked his face. At 33, he looked closer to 45. Alison, the pretty popular sister who had turned the school against me, had hardened. Her once fluid movements now seemed stiff, her expression guarded. The fashionable girl was gone, replaced by a woman in nondescript clothing who couldn't quite meet my eyes. Thomas, now 29, was the most changed. The cruel boy had become a thin, nervous-looking man who stood slightly apart from the others as if trying to dissociate himself from the family unit. And there was my mother, Sarah. Her appearance shocked me most of all. James's letter had mentioned she was dying, but seeing the reality was still jarring. She was gaunt, her once auburn hair now completely grey and thin enough to show her scalp in places. Cancer, I would later learn. Advanced pancreatic cancer with perhaps 6 months remaining. Richard was notably absent. Still in prison, I assumed, though I didn't ask. Christina, my mother whispered, her voice trembling. Thank you for coming. I nodded, but didn't trust myself to speak yet. Dr. Lisbon guided us all to seats around the large table, positioning herself strategically between me and the others. Before we begin, Dr. Lisbon said, her professional tone calming my racing heart. I want to remind everyone of our agreement. This is Christina's space. She has graciously agreed to this meeting, but she is under no obligation to listen to anything that makes her uncomfortable. She can end this conversation at any time. Is that clear to everyone? They all nodded solemnly. Christina, Dr. Lisbon continued. Would you like to start, or would you prefer to hear from them first? I had thought about this moment for weeks. I'll listen first. I said, my voice steadier than I felt. They requested this meeting. I want to know why. James cleared his throat. As the oldest, he had apparently appointed himself spokesperson, just as he had once appointed himself my chief tormentor. First, I want to say thank you for agreeing to see us. I know you had every reason to refuse. He paused, seemingly struggling with his next words. What we did to you was monstrous. There's no other word for it. I've had 15 years to think about it, 8 of them in prison, and I still can't comprehend how we became those people. We're not here to make excuses. Alison added, her voice tight with what seemed like genuine emotion. There are no excuses for what we did. We just wanted you to know that we understand now, Thomas said quietly. The gravity of it, the damage we caused, how inexcusable it was. My mother sat silently weeping, looking so frail that I wondered how she had even managed the journey to this meeting. Prison changed me, James continued. Being on the other side of those locked doors, experiencing even a fraction of the confinement we subjected you to. He shook his head. It broke something in me, something that needed breaking. Alison nodded. After my release, I couldn't face anyone. I moved to Oregon, changed my name, tried to start over, but the guilt followed me everywhere. I couldn't form real relationships because I knew what I was capable of, what I had done to my own sister. I've been in therapy for 12 years, Thomas added. Every week, trying to understand how I could have participated in hurting you like that. I was young, but not too young, to know right from wrong. I have no explanation, only profound regret. I listened to them all, searching their faces for signs of manipulation or insincerity, but all I saw was exhaustion, regret, and the heavy weight of actions that couldn't be undone. Why now? I finally asked. It's been 15 years. Why reach out now? They exchanged glances, and my mother finally spoke. I'm dying, Christina. Her voice was a whisper, but it carried the weight of mountains. The doctors give me 6 months at most. Before I go, I needed to see you one more time, to tell you how sorry I am for failing you so completely, for not protecting you when that was my one job as your mother." The room fell silent. Dr. Lisbon watched me carefully, ready to intervene if the conversation became too overwhelming. I looked at each of them in turn, these people who had once been my family, who had turned my childhood into a waking nightmare. I had imagined this moment many times over the years, rehearsed cutting remarks that would make them feel even a fraction of the pain they had caused me. But sitting here now, face to face with their broken lives, I felt something unexpected pity. "I didn't come here to absolve you," I said finally. "I don't have that power, and it's not my responsibility to ease your guilt." They all nodded, accepting this harsh truth. "But I did come to say this: what you did to me does not define me. I have built a life that is beautiful and meaningful. I help children who have experienced trauma similar to what I endured. I have a husband who loves me. I have a daughter." I paused, watching their reactions to this news. "A daughter," my mother whispered, her eyes filling with fresh tears. I nodded and reached into my bag, withdrawing a single photograph of Lily on her 3rd birthday, her smile radiant as she blew out her candles. I placed it on the table but didn't push it toward them. "Her name is Lily. She will never meet you. She will grow up knowing only love and security, everything I didn't have. She will never know what it's like to be hungry or afraid in her own home." "Okay, son." My mother stared at the photograph, not reaching for it, but drinking in the image of the grandchild she would never know. "I forgive you," I said, after a long moment, surprising even myself with the words. "Not because you deserve it, but because carrying hate for you has become too heavy. I'm setting that burden down today." The relief on their faces was palpable, but I wasn't finished. "Forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. After today, I don't want any further contact from any of you. My life now is separate from the past you represent. I hope you find peace, but it won't be through a relationship with me." Dr. Lisbon nodded approvingly. We had discussed this boundary extensively in our preparation sessions. "We understand," James said quietly. "We didn't come expecting a relationship, just the chance to apologize face to face, to acknowledge what we did without excuses or justifications." "Is there anything you want to ask us?" Alison offered hesitantly. "Anything that might help you find closure?" I considered her question carefully. There was one thing that had haunted me all these years, one question that therapy had never fully resolved. "Why?" I asked simply. "Not why you abused me. I understand that came from Richard's hatred and your loyalty to him. But why did none of you ever see me as human, as your sister? What made it so easy to treat me like I wasn't even a person?" The question hung heavy in the air. James and Alison exchanged pained glances while Thomas stared at his hands. "We dehumanized you," James finally said. "It started with the affair revelation, this idea that you weren't really our sister. But that was just the beginning. To do what we did, we had to convince ourselves you deserved it somehow, that you were fundamentally different from us." "It was easier than facing our own cruelty," Alison added. "If you weren't really a person with feelings like ours, then we weren't really monsters for hurting you. Richard encouraged it," my mother said softly. "He referred to you as the mistake when you weren't around. He created an environment where you were seen as other, as less than, and in my medicated fog, I failed to counter that narrative." Their answers made a terrible kind of sense. Dehumanization is the first step toward cruelty in any context, from schoolyard bullying to genocide. People need to see their victims as fundamentally different, fundamentally less, to justify their actions. "Thank you for your honesty," I said, feeling a strange sense of closure. The mystery that had haunted me wasn't really a mystery at all, but the oldest and most human of failings, the ability to stop seeing others as fully human. Dr. Lisbon glanced at her watch. "We have about 15 minutes left. Christina, is there anything else you'd like to say or ask?" I thought for a moment, then nodded. "I want you all to know that despite everything, I have found happiness. Not because of what you did, but in spite of it. The hardest lesson I've learned is that trauma shapes us, but it doesn't have to define us. I hope each of you has learned that too." One by one, they nodded. "I hope your remaining time is peaceful," I said directly to my mother, acknowledging her terminal diagnosis. "I don't hate you. I stopped hating all of you a long time ago. Hate takes too much energy, and my energy is better spent on those who love me now." As our hour drew to a close, I stood to leave. I had said what I needed to say and heard what I needed to hear. The photograph of Lily remained on the table. "The picture is for you, Mum," I said quietly. "Just the picture, not contact. She nodded, tears streaming down her face as she carefully took the photograph with trembling hands. She's beautiful. She looks like you did at that age. She's nothing like me, I corrected gently. She's growing up loved and safe. That makes all the difference. As Dr. Lisbon walked me to the door, James spoke one last time. Christina, he said, his voice catching, you deserve so much better than what we gave you. I know words are inadequate, but I am truly sorry. I nodded in acknowledgement, but didn't turn back. I had spent enough of my life looking backward. As I closed the door behind me, I felt lighter than I had in years, as if I had finally put down a burden I hadn't fully realized I was still carrying. David was waiting in the reception area, concern evident on his face. When he saw me, he stood immediately. How did it go? He asked, searching my expression. I took his hand and smiled. It went exactly as it needed to. Let's go home to Lily. As we stepped out into the sunshine, I realized something profound. The scars of my past would always be part of me, but they had finally healed into something I could carry without pain. I had faced my abusers, not as the terrified child they had tormented, but as the strong whole woman I had become. I was Christina Rivera, artist therapist, wife, mother, survivor. My story wasn't defined by what had been done to me, but by what I had done with my life in spite of it. And that story was still being written one beautiful day at a time. Have you ever had to forgive someone who deeply hurt you? What did forgiveness mean to you in that situation? Was it about them, or was it, as it was for me, about freeing yourself from the burden of carrying that pain? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe for more stories of healing and resilience. Remember, your past may shape you, but it doesn't have to define you. Thank you for listening to my journey.